Ottawa, Canada's capital, it's the Computer Podcast. Hello, I'm your host, Norman Jack. With me today, as usual, my co-host, George Valenzuela. George, things are keeping well with you, I hope?
Things are tickety-boo, Norm, tickety-boo. Hopefully the same with
good.
you.
Yeah, doing very well, thank you. Lots of things going on in the news today that we want to talk about as well. We're going to be exploring how to keep your computer tuned to a tip-top shape to make sure you're getting the most effective use out of your machine, being that a lot of us are using them a lot more than we used to. With us today, our special guest, Paul Middleveen from the Trailing Edge, tte.ca. Good to see you, Paul.
Good to see you too. Thanks for having me.
In the news this week, a couple of interesting stories out there, one of which talks about the National Security Agency in the United States warning that virtual private networks, VPNs, could be vulnerable to attacks if not properly secured. Now, of course, many of us are working from home now for the first time, and hopefully most of us are using secure VPNs to communicate with our computers at work. But apparently, because of that, there's also been a large-scale increase in hacking attempts on these virtual private networks. Being that you're not sitting in the office and using a sort of a closed system machine, that means that your network, your company's facilities, are accessible by hackers. The question is, can they crack through them? George, when you take a look at this, because you do all of your work in secure VPN fashion here, is this a threat that they should be taking seriously, or can we assume that corporate security teams are already aware of this and taking action to prevent it?
I certainly would hope the latter, Norm. I mean, this is something that occurs, like if you're in the IT department of any major corporation, you have a security team that is basically just 24/7 around the clock looking at intrusion detection, brute force attacks, spoofing. Everybody knows that the single biggest threat is the employees' laptops, right, or the computers, the devices people bring in and connect to the office systems. You can only do so much to change, I guess, corporate culture or people's habits, but you can certainly do a lot to secure systems. What they're talking about here, the VPN. We talked a little bit about this last week. Is there's one VPN the process starts on your laptop when you connect to the system, but it connects to a VPN entry point. And those are the entry points they're discussing in this article, is that those entry points are subject to a growing amount of investigation, sniffing around by malicious actors. So they're throwing, port sniffers in there. They're looking for zero-day attacks or zero-day vulnerabilities. They're looking for all sorts of things. So yes, I'm sure that the companies have stepped up security to make sure that those access points are, top of the line patched, looking for extraneous connections, maybe killing connections that have lasted for too long, doing whatever it takes for them to secure their environment, right, and their investments. But of course, there's always a weak point at the entry point where everybody, on their local laptops, logging into VPN access points, which has not changed since day one, really.
Yeah. Now, tell me, what can the individual employee do at home to take part in this prevention type measure? What should you be doing? What should I be doing as we're accessing our corporate virtual private networks to help stem this threat?
I think the number one biggest thing that people should be aware of is when you're using your computer from home to connect to your work systems, you should treat that computer as if it was a work computer. 99% of the time, it's obviously a computer that was given to you by your employer, so it technically is their property, but it's in your home. So you really need to treat it as if it was a part of the office, right? Don't use it to, upload your kids' photos from your vacation, or don't plug in USB keys to it that you don't know, where they came from. Don't even plug in ones that you're sure have been sitting in your drawer for a couple of weeks. It doesn't really matter. You should just assume that you've got an IT person standing behind you, looking over your shoulder, saying, don't do that. So make sure you're only using authorized equipment to connect to it. Make sure you're not connecting Wi-Fi hotspots that are, insecure, like that don't have a password, at least the minimum password protection on it. Don't use, Wi-Fi hotspots to VPN in, because there's so many potential risks and other systems that are kind of just sniffing around, waiting for an opportunity to track your keys, to log whatever traffic that you're hitting, to try to decipher and encode or decode the password to get into your VPN is just not worth the effort. So if you're sitting in an airport, although these days you're not, but if you're sitting in an internet cafe, just wait till you get home before you connect. Just take the extra 5 seconds. I know that the temptation might be there, and they tout VPNs as ultra safe, but it for the purposes of ultra safety, just connect to it from your home network, and don't let other people who are visiting your home maybe attached to your Wi-Fi network now. Maybe it's time to set up a guest network. Those are very just common sense steps that anyone can take.
Okay, that sounds good. Well, it looks like it's the end for the Google Pixel 3 series of phones. The 3A and the 3XL ran out last week. Apparently, Google's now not selling them anymore, saying that their inventories have been exhausted. Now, this, of course, brings forth the rumors that is a 4A, the less expensive version of the Google Pixel phones, going to be coming out. They've had some announcements. They've canceled the announcements. There have been rumors floating around. The big question, I guess, now is whether this popular phone is going to make it to the 4A stage, or, George, whether they just skip over it now and go to 5.
I've heard so many different messages, one saying one thing, the other one saying the other thing. It's really confusing right now exactly to know which phone is coming out, where supply chains have been affected around the world. I honestly don't really know what the right answer is. Based on the latest messaging that I've seen, I'm fairly certain we'll see a 4A. Maybe there's a limited release 4A. But I've heard just as much about the 5 coming out, in October, I think is the usual time for Google Pixels to release. So we're already starting to come across, to pass the time where the 4A should have been announced. Could they do a 4A 5 at the same time? Who knows? I mean, anything's on the table right now. I think I'm going to sit on the sidelines on this one, having read the specs for both. I think I'm going to be happy with my 4XL for the foreseeable future. I just don't see a big enough reason, compelling enough reason to jump the 4 figures to upgrade the phone for really not much of a difference. I'm already running the 11 beta, so I'm happy with that.
Yeah, and I guess that's the big issue too, is with most cell phones these days, the new releases aren't coming every 3 months or every 6 months like they used to. And when they do come out, there aren't huge increases. It's sort of like desktop computers now, you don't know whether this is going to be worth the impact, because the impact of the changes don't seem to be worth the higher prices these days.
It's kind of a weird stasis that we're in, right? Where everybody's kind of found their niche, and they're executing it to the best as their ability within that niche. So there's very little crossover now. They try to separate from each other and still provide something each distinct, so that you have to really think about which one you want based on kind of where your tendencies lie. It's really interesting where we're at right now in the smartphone market. It's just so saturated that you really have to be well established in your area, so that you kind of have that loyal following that's always going to buy the next iteration. But that next iteration comes at such a huge cost that they may decide to skip one just because it's not worth the investment, right? They're just going to get to the next one and just kind of hope for the best at that point. So it's very interesting.
Yeah. Okay, on to our topic this week: keeping your computer tuned up to its highest efficiency as you're using it more and more. We've got some interesting tips from you to keep things cleaned up both mechanically and physically, to make sure that your computer's operating top-notch right now. Paul, we were talking before the show about some interesting issues with the older style platter hard drives. You always want your hard drive to run most efficiently, and apparently there's a difference in the way hard drives run, something I never knew. I thought they were all just spinning platters with the little sensor heads moving back and forth.
Yeah, they're pretty cool little devices, and as you say, the technology has been changing over the years. They're always trying to figure out how to cram more bits and bytes into your platters and get the biggest and largest drive capable. Doing this process, there's a newer format of writing to a drive and reading a drive, and that is PMR and SMR. And essentially that means perpendicular or shingled magnetic recording. So essentially, as the little read-write head is running along the disk, in the PMR style, essentially it would write a track, and there wouldn't be anything necessarily being overwritten. And your write track is slightly larger, like your write head is slightly larger than the read head. Mm-hmm. So you didn't really have a large issue with RAID array drives and things like that. and it's easier to recover the data if the drive is failing. And then there's a newer format that they're using on drives called shingled magnetic recording. And essentially this technology is very cool and interesting, but what it does is it's literally layering the data. So rather than having a single track for reading and writing, now those layers are sort of almost being layered half on top of each other. So you still can read the data as long as the read head can come along and pick it up along that track. It can get the data. But let's say you have to change that data now. Because it's layered, it now marks that area of the hard drive it has to be rewritten. It has to rewrite both tracks eventually. And what's happening is a lot of our drives now have bigger and bigger caches. Again, this helps with our performance. But in particular, with the shingled style drives, all of those jobs and tasks that you're doing are being temporarily written to that cache. And then once your computer becomes idle, it has to now do a maintenance mode on the hard drive where now it's reorganizing your whole drive. So in every day-to-day use, it may not creep up and bug you. But if you're doing a lot of large file reads and writes, you're doing a lot of work, with photos or larger data sets, that's really going to slow the performance of these drives down tremendously, like hundreds of percents wise in terms of reading and writing. So in some RAID arrays, if you don't know that you have this type of drive or you're mixing PMR and like basically, a single track versus a layered track drives together on a RAID array, if any of those drives fail, or you're putting huge data sets in there, this can slow the performance of a RAID array down to a crawl. Trying to do data recovery on layered data is good luck. Have fun. Yeah. We've been talking with some of our companies in town that we do data recovery with, and this is definitely a problem, especially as I say in the enterprise level stuff. If you don't know that you have some of these drives in there.
So if you need expansion of your space to make your operation of your computer more efficient, go for one of those perpendicular hard drives if you're buying one of the old style ones. But I guess, George, the biggest tip in terms of speeding access to data is to go for solid state drives these days.
Oh yeah, anytime you look at a laptop now, if it's priced in the mid to upper brand, like mid to upper space in terms of price-wise, there's got to be an SSD drive on there, right? I would not pay top dollar for a laptop without SSD on it. It's it runs quieter. Obviously, there's no moving parts. You can cram a lot more space into a lot more storage into a lot smaller space, and it doesn't need to be defragged, basically, which is a nice kind of feature about it, right? So you don't have a spinning head anymore, so it doesn't matter where the files are located, where the fragments of the files are located, because there's no spinning head. Which kind of defeats the purpose of defragmenting. So it is something that I would even recommend on a desktop. I've got multiple disks on my desktops, and the first disk, the boot disk, is always the SSD, and any additional storage I just slap on, whatever cheap drive, not a cheap drive, but if I've got a drive lying around, I just slap that on as a regular platter drive for storage, right? But the boot drive is always SSD, and the difference in boot up time is noticeable.
Yeah.
Tremendous. Yeah.
And I guess a lot more reliable too, because you don't have those heads moving across, some sort of plate.
Oh, and let's not kid ourselves. They have gotten better. The first SSDs were not reliable. They were not great. The first ones in the market were better than platters, but they failed quickly, and they had all sorts of issues with read write and so on. The ones that are out now, I mean, we've got Paul, up to 6 gigabytes per second theoretical maximum transfer, I think. Yeah. So these are really fast read write scenarios, or read scenarios, I should say, not write. And they're much more reliable, right? So now you're starting to see some RAID arrays. So some of the higher end RAID arrays are using SSDs as their 2 terabyte storage drive, which is amazing. Just thinking of where we were even like 2 or 3 years ago.
If you like the performance of the SSDs, the newer ones, look for NVMe technology. Mm-hmm. Again, this is a performance boost compared to your 2.5 inch slot on your notebook or your M.2 slot. You're getting about anywhere from about 3 to about 6 times the speed increase from your standard SSD. So again, if you're looking for that ultimate performance, just make sure your machine has NVMe capability or an SSD that is NVMe.
Okay. Now, you mentioned an interesting thing, George, defragging the platter-style hard drives. Does anybody do that anymore?
I mean, I suppose if you have platter drives, it's
Yeah.
still a good idea to keep it defragged. Again, where we've gone to the point where if you've got a modern operating system like Windows 10, you don't really need to, because I think Windows 10 takes care of that. I think it might even have a built-in, I don't know what they call it, defragmenter or drive cleanup utility. If you're using an operating system such as Mac or Linux, the underlying architecture and the file system itself is less prone to fragmenting or less likely to have performance hits because of fragmentation of files. So I think we've got to the point where the having to buy a third-party tool to keep it defragmented is becoming less and less necessary. But certainly for platter drives, it's something still that you want to keep an eye on, right? Look at performance and degradation, and of course wear and tear on that kind of drive just happens a lot faster than an SSD, right? Because the fact it is spinning. So
now let's talk about some of the things we can do to speed up. The most notable one that I hear is speed up access to my computer when I boot it up because it's so slow. The biggest issue seems to be in how many programs are actually starting up when you crank up your computer. And I think a lot of people would be surprised to go in and find out how many programs are actually starting to operate then. Programs they think are still asleep.
This is pretty much a feature. I mean, I'd say it's pretty much feature Windows, but I mean, it's most likely in Windows. That's where everybody's talking, really, because that's where most of us are using our home computers, our Windows systems. You have to really keep an eye on that startup tray. You have to look at, and I think in the old days with Windows 95, you'd have a folder called startup. So you could physically see what programs are sitting in that folder.
It was a lot easier then.
Well, and again, programs stop respecting that because they just started up as helper programs or system tray options, and then the need to have a startup folder became basically redundant, right? Yeah, irrelevant. But yes, you have to really watch out. A lot of the systems that when you buy a printer or you buy another peripheral, it says, oh, here's a CD. You put the CD in, you install the software. It's like it's got. We'll let you know when the ink trays are dry, or we'll let you know when you need to buy a new cartridge, or we'll need to know we'll let you know when your camera lenses need cleaning or whatever. All that stuff is completely unnecessary to have running in the background. Be very careful when you're installing drivers and helper systems. Don't install unless you really need to use the scanner software and you need to use all that other stuff. Just install the basic required driver to get printing communication to your printer. Most times, Windows will already have it bundled in with it. You don't even need to install that CD that comes with the printer, for example. But yeah, watch out when you're downloading stuff off the internet. Sometimes helper programs are just kind of along for the ride. You don't even know it's there. I would say, depending, especially now that we're on our computers a lot more because we're stuck at home, once a month, I'd say, just do an inventory of what you've got on your computer. What programs have you installed? Look through your program files, look through your program x86 files folder, and just see if they match up with what you've got installed. Do you really need 5 different versions of this program that you've got, or do you need 17 different games? Do a routine checkup and cleaning if you can. Uninstalling programs. It wouldn't be a bad idea as well to use the uninstall feature in Windows to go through that list of programs that it says are installed, and see how many versions of a certain thing you have, or programs that you probably didn't even realize you had installed or running on there, right? And just do a quick uninstall that way and clean things up. It would make a huge difference.
One of the things I have noticed too is that if you go into your Windows programs installed function and want to clean things up, sometimes you're going to come across what seem to be unintelligible program names, and you think, what does this do? I don't want to take it out because I may harm something that I'm actually using. The easiest way I've found to double check on things like that is simply copy the name and put it into Google and see what pops up.
Yeah.
And that way you can tell exactly what that program is related to. And if you go, oh my gosh, that's connected to a program that I use all the time, I'm not going to touch it. But if I look at the name of the program that is involved with that, and it's something I don't really need anymore, bang, it's gone. And then I don't have to worry about whether I'm knocking something out that I should be keeping.
Yeah, and for Windows as well, you want to take a look at the users folder. So under users, you've got your login name, and then under that, you've got, documents and pictures and videos and so on. Take a look at the downloads folder, for example. You might find a lot of things down there that you had no idea was there, right? It's so easy on a browser to say, yeah, click on here just to download, and then you forget about it.
Yeah.
And you go to that downloads folder and you do a properties on it, and you say 27 gigs. What have I got on there? And you've just got stuff that you've never even seen, like you've never heard of before, and you never even had maybe the intention of installing it, but it's such an easy thing to do to click and download it and say, I'll check it out later. And then you just completely forget about it. Look at that and routinely clean it up as well, right? It's worth saving, that extra 10 gigs of space. Trust me.
Yeah. Now, Paul, let's talk briefly about physically cleaning the machine. You've got desktops, of course. You can go in there as long as you're isolating yourself with a strap to get rid of all that static electricity. You can use any of the computer vacuums that you guys have at TTE to try and clean things out. I guess the big thing for a lot of people, though, especially with more of us working at home, how do you keep the darn laptop clean? Because, you can go in there with one of those little vacuums, I guess, but it doesn't seem to be quite as easy to keep that clean.
Yeah, the vacuum can always work, but there's small little blower devices that we have as well, along with cans of compressed air. We do also have some products by a company called Whoosh that carries a lot of various antimicrobial cloths, cleaning solutions for your phone. It's pretty much a universal liquid that can be used on your phones, your screens, your computer peripherals and parts. Definitely, you can also use something called, I think it's called Goo Gone or Goop Gone. Anyway, it's like a green style Play-Doh that you can use to mush around on your keyboard devices. It goes into most of the cracks and crevices and pulls out those little bits of dirt that got stuck in there. So definitely use something like that. Antimicrobial cloths, much recommended. And just clean your equipment regularly. Make a routine out of it, as we all are.
Exactly. Okay, well, that's all the time we've got for the Computer Podcast this week. My thanks to our special guest, Paul Middleveen. Paul, take care, and we'll hopefully see you next week.
Both you take care. Thank you so much for having me.
And, of course, George, we'll see you next week.
Norm, we'll see you.
And we'll see you next week here on the Computer Podcast. Interesting programming.